What is communism?
Communism is the doctrine of the conditions of the liberation of the proletariat.
What is the proletariat?
The proletariat is that class in society which draws its means of livelihood wholly and solely from the sale of its labor and not from the profit from any kind of capital, whose weal and woe, whose life and death, whose whole existence depends on the demand for labor, hence, on the alternations of good times and bad in business, on the vagaries of unbridled competition. The proletariat, or class of proletarians, is, in a word, the working class of the 19th century and thereafter.
Proletarians, then, have not always existed.
No. Poor folk and working classes have always existed, and the working classes have mostly been poor. But there have not always been workers and poor people living under the conditions just stated. In other words, there have not always been proletarians any more than there has always been free and unbridled competition.
How did the proletariat originate?
The proletariat originated in the Industrial Revolution, which took place in England in the second half of the 18th century and which has since then been repeated in all the civilized countries of the world. This Industrial Revolution was brought about by the invention of the steam engine, various spinning machines, the power loom, and a whole series of other mechanical devices. These machines, which were very expensive and hence could be bought only by big capitalists, altered the whole previous mode of production and ousted the former workers because machines turned out cheaper and better commodities than could the workers with their inefficient spinning wheels and hand looms. These machines delivered industry wholly into the hands of the big capitalists and rendered the workers' meager property, tools, hand looms, etc., entirely worthless, so that the capitalists soon had everything in their hands and nothing remained to the workers. This marked the introduction of the factory system into the textile industry. Once the impulse to the introduction of machinery and the factory system had been given, this system spread quickly to all other branches of industry, especially cloth and book printing, pottery and the metalware industry. Labor was more and more divided among the individual workers, so that the worker who formerly had done a complete piece of work, now did only part of that piece. This division of labor made it possible to supply products faster and therefore more cheaply. It reduced the activity of the individual worker to a very simple, constantly repeated mechanical motion which could be performed not only as well but much better by a machine. In this way, all these industries fell one after another under the dominance of steam, machinery and the factory system, just as spinning and weaving had already done. But at the same time they also fell into the hands of the big capitalists, and there too the workers were deprived of the last shred of independence. Gradually, not only did manufacture proper come increasingly under the dominance of the factory system, but the handicrafts, too, did so as big capitalists ousted the small masters more and more by setting up large workshops which saved many expenses and permitted an elaborate division of labor. This is how it has come about that in the civilized countries almost all kinds of labor are performed in factories and that in almost all branches handicraft and manufacture have been superseded by large-scale industry. This process has to one ever greater degree ruined the old middle class, especially the small handicraftsmen. It has entirely transformed the condition of the workers, and two new classes have come into being which are gradually swallowing up all others, namely, the class of big capitalists, who in all civilized countries are already in almost exclusive possession of all the means of subsistence and of the raw materials and instruments, machines, factories, necessary for the production of the means of subsistence. This is the bourgeois class, or the bourgeoisie. The class of the wholly propertyless, who were obliged to sell their labor to the bourgeoisie in order to get in exchange the means of subsistence necessary for their support. This class is called the class of proletarians, or the proletariat.
Under what conditions does this sale of the labor of the proletarians to the bourgeoisie take place?
Labor is a commodity like any other, and its price is therefore determined by exactly the same laws that apply to other commodities. In a regime of large-scale industry or of free competition, as we shall see, the two come to the same thing, The price of a commodity is on the average always equal to the costs of production. Hence the price of labor is also equal to the costs of production of labor. But the costs of production consist of precisely the quantity of means of subsistence necessary to keep the worker fit for work and to prevent the working class from dying out. The worker will therefore get no more for his labor than is necessary for this purpose. The price of labor or the wage will therefore be the lowest, the minimum, required for the maintenance of life. However, since business is sometimes worse and sometimes better, the worker receives sometimes more and sometimes less, just as the factory owner sometimes gets more and sometimes less for his commodities. But just as the factory owner, on the average of good times and bad, gets no more and no less for his commodities than their costs of production, so the worker will, on the average, get no more and no less than this minimum. This economic law of wages operates the more strictly the greater the degree to which large-scale industry has taken possession of all branches of production.
What working classes were there before the Industrial Revolution?
According to the different stages of the development of society, the working classes have always lived in different circumstances and had different relations to the owning and ruling classes. In antiquity, the working people were the slaves of the owners, just as they still are in many backward countries and even in the southern part of the United States. In the Middle Ages they were the serfs of the land-owning nobility, as they still are in Hungary, Poland and Russia. In the Middle Ages and right up to the Industrial Revolution there were also journeymen in the towns who worked in the service of petty bourgeois masters. Gradually, as manufacture developed, there emerged manufacturing workers who were even then employed by larger capitalists.
In what way does the proletarian differ from the slave?
The slave is sold once and for all. The proletarian must sell himself daily and hourly. The individual slave, the property of a single master, is already assured an existence, however wretched it may be, because of the master's interest. The individual proletarian, the property, as it were, of the whole bourgeois class, which buys his labor only when someone has need of it, has no secure existence. This existence is assured only to the proletarian class as a whole. The slave is outside competition, the proletarian is in it and experiences all its vagaries. The slave counts as a thing, not as a member of civil society. The proletarian is recognized as a person, as a member of civil society. Thus, the slave can have a better existence than the proletarian, but the proletarian belongs to a higher stage of social development and himself stands on a higher level than the slave. The slave frees himself when, of all the relations of private property, he abolishes only the relation of slavery and thereby becomes a proletarian himself. The proletarian can free himself only by abolishing private property in general.